My name is Iris Caldwell, and I manage special assets for a firm that buys problems other people are desperate to hide. I am good at reading balance sheets, better at spotting risk, and very good at knowing when silence is more useful than speech. That morning in Seattle, I was invited to a signing that was supposed to change everything for my family. Even though no one expected me to participate, I was there because I was family, not because I mattered. I reached for a chair at the long table, and my mother, Lorraine Caldwell, slid it back with her foot and told me to stand off to the side so I would not be in the way. She said it casually, like this had always been my place. And my father Thomas did not look up when it happened. My brother, Ryan, adjusted his jacket and kept talking about opportunity, about momentum, about the kind of deal that separates winners from people who play it safe. I stepped aside because arguing would have only confirmed what they already believed. They handed me a glass pitcher and asked me to keep the water filled. And no one noticed how easily I took the weight of it. Ryan laughed when someone joked that I was always reliable. And my father nodded as if that was the highest praise available. The room was polished wood and confident voices. All of it built to make one person feel important. I stood quietly at the edge of it, exactly where they expected me to stay. What they did not know was that I had already read the numbers tied to the deal they were celebrating. I had seen the liquidity gaps, the timing problems, the kind of weakness that only shows itself when people rush. As I held the pitcher and watched them talk over one another, I checked the time and waited. The meeting had not started yet, but the outcome was already set. Ryan took control of the room without being asked, setting his leather briefcase on the table as if it belonged there and talking through the deal before anyone invited him to. He said this was the kind of moment that defined a family's future, the kind of risk that separated men who built legacies from people who settled for stability. My father, Thomas, nodded along, repeating the word legacy like it was a currency, adding that some people understood momentum while others spent their lives calculating rent. No one looked at me when he said it. When Lorraine noticed me shifting my weight near the table, she said, "Just keep the water moving. Iris, don't hover," and slid the pitcher closer with 2 fingers. Ryan glanced over and smiled. The quick kind meant to signal humor. And someone laughed when he said, "I was dependable. Always good for the small things." Thomas added that reliability mattered, but only after ambition was handled. And Ryan tapped his briefcase as if it were proof. I moved because that was the role they had already assigned. From where I stood, I could see how Ryan leaned back once the laughter settled, how he waited for it, how he needed it to continue. He talked about access and exclusivity, about how this partnership would finally put him in rooms where decisions were made. And Thomas interrupted only to say that boldness had built everything they owned. Lorraine watched Ryan the way she watched centerpieces at her events, measuring how well the room responded. I held the pitcher steady and listened. They spoke over one another, finishing each other's sentences, polishing the same story until it shined. Ryan said the numbers were clean. Thomas said the timing was perfect. And Lorraine reminded everyone that some people were born to lead while others supported from the margins. I refilled the glasses when they dipped below half because that was what I was asked to do. No one noticed how quiet I was, and no one wondered why. I already knew the name of the firm Ryan was trying to buy his way into because I had seen it surface weeks earlier in a quiet internal report. It was the kind of name that only looked impressive at a distance. Aggressive in its language, thin in its disclosures, structured to attract cash before anyone asked hard questions. Standing there with the pitcher, I watched the edge of his folder lift just enough for me to read it again. And my stomach stayed calm because the numbers had already spoken to me. Nothing about that deal was stable. Ryan kept talking about how selective they were, how they only opened the door to people who could move fast. And my father leaned into that urgency like it was proof of legitimacy. I listened to the phrases Ryan repeated. liquidity, velocity, early access. The same vocabulary I had seen used by firms trying to outrun their own balance sheets. The confidence in his voice did not match the fragility of the structure behind the name. That mismatch was not dramatic. It was familiar. I had not planned to be involved, and I had not planned to intervene, because I knew how these rooms treated warnings. The last time I had tried to point out a flaw in Ryan's plans, Thomas had said I was too cautious. That fear dressed itself up as intelligence when it wanted to feel important. Lorraine had agreed without looking at me, smoothing the table linen as if that settled the matter. So I said nothing now, because silence was the only position they allowed me to hold. As Ryan spoke, I felt the weight of what he was risking without naming it. Not just money, but exposure he did not understand. I knew the firm he admired was already straining against its obligations, already dependent on fresh capital to cover gaps it could not admit. I stood there listening to praise and predictions, knowing exactly how thin the margin really was. The room believed the story because it wanted to, and that belief was the opening. Marcus Fielding arrived without ceremony, taking the open seat as if it had been waiting for him the entire time, and the room adjusted around his presence. He introduced himself as overseeing compliance for the partnership and said, calmly, that before anything moved forward he needed confirmation of liquid assets. Ryan responded quickly, saying the funds were ready and the documentation was already prepared. His voice a half-beat louder than before. Thomas nodded and added that speed mattered today. That hesitation cost opportunities. And Marcus replied that verification was not hesitation. It was policy. Ryan opened his briefcase and slid a folder forward, explaining that everything was there and that the numbers spoke for themselves. Marcus did not touch it and instead asked for the original digital statement sent directly from the issuing bank, saying they could not rely on printed copies for onboarding. Ryan laughed once and said that was unnecessary, that this was standard documentation. And Marcus answered that standards were not suggestions. From where I stood, I saw Ryan's hand tighten before he reached for his laptop. He said he could forward the file immediately and asked where to send it. Trying to sound relaxed as he typed, Marcus gave him an address and added that timing mattered because the firm had other candidates waiting if this window closed. Ryan said, "It's clean. You'll see," and hit send, leaning back as if the hardest part was done. My phone vibrated a second later with the incoming attachment, and I kept my face neutral because the mistake had already been made. Marcus glanced at his tablet and said they had received the document, then asked a few routine questions about transfer timing and availability. Ryan answered confidently, repeating figures he had rehearsed, while Thomas watched him with relief settling back into his shoulders. Lorraine smiled and said she knew this would work out, that it always did when Ryan trusted his instincts. I held the picture steady and listened, knowing the file that had just been sent carried more weight than anyone in that room understood. The attachment sat open on my phone while Marcus continued the conversation. His voice, even as he asked Ryan to confirm the availability window for the funds. Ryan said the transfer could happen immediately, that the money was sitting untouched and ready. And Thomas echoed him by saying there was no reason to doubt paperwork that had already been prepared. Marcus replied that confirmation was a process, not a feeling. And Ryan smiled as if that distinction did not apply to him. I watched his confidence settle back into place the moment the file left his hands. Marcus scrolled through the document in silence and asked, "This statement reflects current balances as of today." "Correct." And Ryan answered yes, without hesitation. Lorraine leaned forward and said she appreciated how thorough the firm was, adding that attention to detail was what separated serious partners from amateurs. Marcus acknowledged her comment and said that digital records allowed for precise verification, which was why originals mattered. Ryan nodded, repeating that everything was clean, that there would be no surprises. The file itself was quiet, ordinary, formatted to look official. But it carried the small inconsistencies that never showed themselves unless someone bothered to look. The figures lined up too neatly. The timestamps sat too close together. And the metadata marked the document as having been edited shortly before it was sent. None of that was visible on the surface. And Ryan relied on that invisibility the same way he always did. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, already moving on in his head. Marcus said they would proceed with internal verification and thanked Ryan for his prompt response. And Thomas exhaled like the tension had finally broken. Lorraine smiled at Ryan and said she knew he would pull it off. That he always did when it counted. Ryan glanced toward me and joked that even I must understand how big this was. And I lowered my eyes because that was what kept the room calm. The fraud did not announce itself. It settled in quietly, carried by a single click that everyone else had already forgotten. The room in Portland felt smaller than the one in Seattle. Quieter, stripped of the confidence that had carried Ryan earlier. And Marcus began by saying they needed to address discrepancies before anything could proceed. He said the internal review flagged issues that could not be waived. And Ryan answered that there had to be a mistake because the file had already been accepted. Thomas leaned forward and said this was becoming unnecessary, that the paperwork had been clear. And Marcus replied that clarity was exactly what they were missing. I stayed where I was, listening, because the shift had already begun. Marcus explained that the statement Ryan submitted did not originate directly from the issuing bank and that the system marked it as manually altered. Ryan laughed once and said that was impossible, that he had sent exactly what he received. And Marcus told him the metadata said otherwise. Lorraine said there had to be an explanation, that files moved through hands all the time. And Marcus answered that altered financial documents triggered mandatory escalation. The word mandatory settled over the table and did not move. Ryan said, "You're overthinking this." And Thomas added that Ryan had never lied about money, that this was his son, not a criminal. Marcus said intent was not his concern, only the act, and that transmitting false financial information carried consequences regardless of motive. Ryan's voice sharpened as he said they were wasting time, that deals like this required trust. And Marcus said trust was built after verification, not before it. I watched Ryan's confidence thin as the words stopped working. I stepped forward then and said, "Marcus, we should be precise." And the room turned toward me for the first time all day. Ryan frowned and asked what I thought I was doing. And I said I was clarifying ownership because it mattered now. Thomas told me to stop interfering, that this was not my place. And I answered that it was, because the firm conducting the review was operating under my authority. The silence that followed was clean and final. Marcus placed the documents on the table and confirmed what I had said, that I held controlling interest in the assets tied to the partnership. Ryan stared at the paper and said my name like it was a mistake. And Lorraine whispered that this was not funny. Thomas asked how long this had been going on, and I told him long enough to know exactly what had been sent and when. No one interrupted me that time. Marcus explained the options in measured language, that the submission constituted a material misrepresentation and that further action would follow unless it was resolved immediately. Ryan said this was insane, that families did not do this to each other, and Marcus replied that compliance did not recognize family. Thomas looked at the papers again and asked what resolution meant, and Marcus said it meant addressing the exposure before it left the room. I watched my father read every line. Ryan said, "You can't let this happen." And Thomas did not answer him right away. Lorraine said they could fix this later, privately. And Marcus said later was no longer available. Thomas finally looked at me and asked if this was necessary. And I said yes, because the document Ryan sent could not be unseen. The decision passed from hand to hand until it reached him alone. When Thomas signed, The sound of the pen was louder than it should have been, and Ryan pushed back from the table like the room had betrayed him. Lorraine said my name again, this time like a warning, and I did not respond. Marcus collected the papers and said the next steps would be handled accordingly. I stood there as the balance shifted, not because I wanted to be seen, but because the truth no longer allowed me to disappear. Marcus laid out the resolution without raising his voice, saying there were two paths forward, and both were time-sensitive. He said the first involved formal escalation, 2 furls 9, and a review that would move beyond this room. And Ryan said that was a threat, not a process. Marcus answered that it was neither, that it was sequence. And Thomas asked him to explain the alternative. I listened because this was the point where consequences stopped being abstract. Marcus said the second path involved voluntary remediation, immediate transfer of control to neutralize exposure, and documentation that acknowledged the submission error. Ryan said there was no error, that this was being blown out of proportion, and Marcus replied that the system did not recognize proportion, only facts. Lorraine asked if this could be handled quietly, and Marcus said quiet was possible only if action happened now. The word now carried weight none of them argued with. Thomas asked what transfer meant in practical terms, and Marcus said it meant assigning the relevant assets into a controlled vehicle until the matter was resolved. Ryan said, "You're talking about taking everything," and Marcus corrected him by saying it was about securing what had already been put at risk. Thomas looked at me and asked if that was true, and I said yes because the document Ryan sent created exposure that could not be reversed. No one laughed anymore. Ryan turned toward me and said this was betrayal. That sisters did not do this. And I said that documents did not recognize family roles. Lorraine said I was being cold, that there had to be another way. And Marcus said the window for other ways had closed when the file was transmitted. Thomas asked what would happen if he refused, and Marcus said the matter would proceed automatically. The silence that followed was heavy but precise. Marcus slid the papers closer and said the voluntary transfer would pause further action while the review concluded. Ryan said this was insane and stood up, and Thomas told him to sit down because this was bigger than pride. Lorraine said they needed a moment, and Marcus said they had already used it. I watched my father's hands as he reached for the document again. Thomas asked me, quietly this time, if this would stop what was coming, and I said it would contain it. Ryan said my name like an accusation, and I did not answer because nothing I said would change the math. Marcus said the decision needed to be made, and Thomas nodded once, as if accepting a loss he had known about for longer than he admitted. The pen waited between them. When Thomas signed, he did it carefully, as if precision might soften the outcome. Ryan pushed back his chair and said, this was unforgivable, and Lorraine told him to stop because there was nothing left to argue. Marcus gathered the signed pages and said the matter would proceed under the voluntary terms. I stayed still, because movement would have suggested triumph, and this was not that. Marcus explained the next steps, timelines, and obligations, keeping his tone neutral as if neutrality itself was a form of mercy. Thomas listened without interrupting, and Ryan stared at the table as if it had failed him. Lorraine said my name again, but this time without command or insult. The decision had been made, and the room adjusted around it. The room changed after the signatures were gathered, not with noise but with hesitation, as if everyone was waiting for permission to speak again. Ryan broke it first by saying this was temporary, that things would be fixed once people calmed down, and Thomas told him to lower his voice because nothing was temporary anymore. Lorraine looked between them and asked what would happen next, and Marcus answered that next steps had already been scheduled. I stayed quiet and let the words land where they needed to. Ryan turned toward me and said I had always been jealous, that this was about resentment, not rules. And I told him this was about what he sent, not how he felt. Thomas told Ryan to stop talking because every sentence was making things worse. And Ryan said he was being abandoned when he needed support. Lorraine asked me if I understood what this would do to the family. And I said I understood exactly what had already been done to it. No one contradicted me. Thomas asked Marcus whether there was any flexibility left. And Marcus said compliance did not bend once exposure was acknowledged. Ryan said he needed time, that he had calls to make. And Thomas said there were no calls left that mattered today. Lorraine said they should leave together and talk privately. And Marcus said the review required separation until matters were contained. I watched my brother realize that the room was no longer moving in his direction. Ryan stood and said he was not staying here to be judged. And Thomas told him to sit down because walking away would only confirm the damage. Lorraine reached for Ryan's arm, then stopped. Unsure of her place now. I said nothing because the hierarchy they relied on had already collapsed. Power does not announce itself when it shifts. It simply stops responding to the voices that once controlled it. When the meeting ended, Ryan left first without looking back. And Lorraine followed him with questions she did not know how to ask. Thomas stayed behind and said my name once. Not as an order, but as a pause. And I met his eyes without moving. He said he needed time to understand what had happened. And I said he had just seen it. The room emptied around us. And the balance did not return. I left the building without waiting for anyone. The hallway empty enough that my footsteps did not echo back at me. Outside, the air felt neutral. Neither welcoming nor hostile. Just present. And I stood there long enough to let my breathing slow. My phone buzzed with messages I did not open. Names I did not need to read to know what they wanted. I put the device away because nothing required a response anymore. The car service idled where it was supposed to. And the driver asked if the destination was the same as before. I said yes and gave the address without explanation. Because explanations had been the currency of my family. Not mine. As we pulled away, the building receded into glass and angles. Another structure that had served its purpose and would not miss me. I watched the street instead of the past. I thought about how quiet the resolution had been. How there was no single moment that felt like victory. The paperwork was complete. The exposure contained. The outcome locked into place by signatures that could not be taken back. What remained was not satisfaction, but space. The kind that appears when something heavy is finally set down. I let that space exist without filling it. Later, when I stepped into my own apartment, I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door and did not check the time. No one was waiting for me to explain myself, correct a story, or soften a consequence. I made a simple meal and ate it standing up, because sitting felt unnecessary. For the first time in a long while, the silence did not feel like absence. It felt like ownership. Thank you for staying with this story until the end and for giving it your time. If parts of it felt familiar, I hope you know you are not alone in that quiet recognition. May you find steadier ground, clearer boundaries, and a sense of peace that does not require permission. Wherever you are listening from, I wish you calm, safety, and a future that finally feels like your own.